She must be from catering. Excuse me, miss. Table 9 needs clearing. The words weren't whispered. They weren't shouted, either. Just casually, confidently delivered by strangers who assumed they knew her place in the room. Dr. Amina Blake didn't correct them. She simply looked up, tucked the edge of her tablet into her sleek leather bag, and gave a polite nod. She had heard it before. In elevators, in hotels, in boardrooms. People often spoke to her like she didn't belong, until they read her name tag, until they saw the logo on the presentation, until she opened her mouth and reminded them that power didn't always come dressed in the colors they expected. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. It was a beautiful spring afternoon in Atlanta. The glass atrium of the Horizon Conference Center sparkled with natural light, and the room was already buzzing with anticipation. The occasion was a prestigious women's leadership luncheon hosted by a Fortune 100 firm. A sleek, invitation-only affair meant to spotlight inclusive innovation and the rising stars of the corporate world. White tablecloths covered long banquet tables. Gold-rimmed name tags shimmered on seats. And just outside the catering hall, Dr. Amina Blake stepped into the venue wearing a fitted charcoal blazer, navy heels, and a calm energy that carried more command than a red carpet ever could. But command wasn't what people saw. They saw her skin, her age, her calm silence, and somehow, that translated to assistant, intern, support staff, anything but keynote speaker. She wasn't wearing a staff badge. She wasn't carrying a tray. But the waitress, barely out of college, hadn't hesitated to ask her to help clear coffee cups. Her tone wasn't cruel, just assumptive. Amina gave her a quiet glance and gently stepped back. Then came a middle-aged man, one of the early arrivals. He handed her a stack of used napkins and gestured toward a corner of the room. "You folks are doing great," he muttered. "Try to get to that back table soon." Amina blinked slowly. She didn't frown, didn't flinch. She simply turned her eyes toward the event signage that towered behind her. Keynote address. Dr. Amina Blake, building legacy through leadership. Her face was on the banner, full color, centered, framed by a halo of accolades and corporate sponsorships. And yet somehow, no one saw her. She took her seat quietly at the assigned table in the middle row, checking the agenda on her tablet. Around her, guests chatted about quarterly reports, glass ceilings, DEI initiatives. Some looked at her and offered tight smiles, the kind reserved for staff that might refill your water. One woman leaned over and asked if she knew where the event coordinator had placed the press kits. Amina answered kindly. She always did. But beneath the calm was a quiet truth. This happened far too often. Power, when carried by black women, was always being questioned before it was acknowledged. She watched as more women filtered in. The room was mostly executives. Blazers, pumps, name badges, legacy names. A few carried themselves with the weight of board seats. Some were there to be seen, others to strategize. She noticed the subtle social hierarchy playing out in body language, the way certain women huddled together, only offering head nods to others. The networking had started long before the speeches. Amina didn't try to insert herself. She never had to. She had come here for one reason, to speak, and speak she would. But before that moment arrived, the assumptions kept unfolding. One woman placed her empty wine glass near Amina and asked if she could just take this to the back. Another glanced at her tote and smiled. "Is that where the printed programs are?" Still, Amina said nothing. The sharpest blade in her possession had always been patience, because she didn't need to raise her voice to reclaim her name. It would be projected across the screens soon enough. At one point, a well-known executive, someone who had been featured on the event's sponsor page, approached the table Amina was seated at. She looked confused. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently. "This table is reserved for speakers." Amina glanced at the small silver placard in front of her that read Dr. Amina Blake, keynote. She tapped it once with her finger and offered a simple smile. The woman flushed, then quickly turned and walked away. Still, not a single outburst. Not a single, "Do you know who I am?" Because what made Amina powerful wasn't a need to be seen. It was her decision to wait and let the room realize who they were talking to. One chair over, a younger woman had noticed the shift in the air. She had seen the placard. She had read the banner. And she had also seen the stack of napkins handed to Amina only moments earlier. She whispered to her friend beside her and started recording. "This is going to go viral," she said under her breath. Because when you watch someone erase a leader in plain sight and then discover they made a mistake, it changes you. And when the world sees that same moment, it changes them. And that change was just about to begin. The host walked on stage and tapped the mic. Applause rippled across the hall. The luncheon had officially begun. Introductions followed. The theme of the day, redefining power. And no one in that room knew just how much it was about to be redefined. They would soon learn that the woman they asked to clear plates wasn't here to serve hors d'oeuvres. She was here to serve a lesson. The clinking of glasses and light music filled the elegant ballroom. It was the kind of event where everyone dressed just right and spoke just softly enough to be heard without sounding loud. Every table was perfectly set, the linens crisp, the silverware sparkling. The event was moving along smoothly, or so it seemed from the outside. But for Dr. Amina Blake, something very different was happening. She sat quietly at her assigned table, watching the room with calm eyes. Around her, guests continued to talk, laugh, and network. Every now and then, someone would glance her way. They didn't see her. Not really. To them, she looked out of place, too calm, too still, too quiet to be important. It began again, just like before. A woman seated nearby lifted her hands slightly, signaling for help. She didn't say much, just gave a small nod toward her empty water glass and a pointed glance in Amina's direction. Amina blinked slowly, then returned her gaze to the stage where the opening speaker had just been introduced. But the woman didn't drop it. She leaned toward Amina and whispered, "Would you mind getting the picture from the side table?" Amina smiled politely. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, but she didn't move. Moments later, a man at the next table looked around and spotted Amina. He waved her over casually and gestured at a stack of used plates. "Can we get this cleared?" he asked, not even looking her in the eye. Amina did not respond. Not with anger. Not with words. She simply turned her head and looked out over the room. Her expression was soft, but inside, she felt it, the tightening in her chest, the weight of being made invisible yet again. It wasn't just about water or plates. It was about how people see you when they've already decided who you are. She checked her tablet. Her presentation file was open, perfectly formatted and ready. Her keynote speech was set to begin in less than 20 minutes. Her name was printed clearly on the event agenda, projected on the screens across the room. Yet even with all of that, no one connected the dots. To them, she was still just someone in the background. A few seats away, two younger guests were watching. One of them had noticed the earlier mistake with the waitress. Now she watched as it happened again. Another assumption, another slight. She nudged her friend and pulled out her phone. She started recording. Something about the moment felt too important to ignore. The irony wasn't lost on Amina. This event was meant to celebrate women in leadership. It was filled with panels about breaking ceilings, about building equity in the workplace. The stage backdrop read, "Own your voice." And yet here she was, being treated as if she had no voice at all. A catering staff member walked by and paused beside her. She leaned down and asked if Amina was with the kitchen team. Amina shook her head gently. The woman flushed and quickly moved on, embarrassed. But it wasn't the staff's fault. The confusion came from the guests, from the ones who couldn't imagine that the black woman in the corner seat might be someone important. Amina remained still. She didn't rise to correct anyone. She didn't flash credentials or call out names. She had learned long ago that power didn't need to perform. It needed to observe, to measure, and most importantly, to wait. The crowd buzzed louder now. Someone at the front table raised a toast. Another guest laughed loudly at a joke Amina didn't hear, but her mind wasn't on the conversation. It was on the moments building around her. Every mistaken glance, every misdirected command, every polite assumption. It was all being stored, not out of anger, but as evidence. A woman in a red blazer passed by and smiled tightly at Amina before saying, They really need more servers this year. Her voice was light, but the meaning cut deep. Still, Amina's posture never changed. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Her head held high. If they couldn't see who she was yet, that wasn't her burden to carry. The younger woman with the phone captured another moment. A speaker on stage referencing diversity while a guest just off-camera handed Amina a used napkin. The contrast was striking. The video would go viral later, but for now, it was just truth being recorded. At the far end of the room, the event coordinator was whispering into a headset. She hadn't noticed the mistakes being made at Amina's table. Her attention was on the speaker order, the lighting, the press at the back. But her phone buzzed. A text from the social media team. "Hey, someone just posted a video. Do you know who this woman is?" The attached clip showed Amina politely nodding as a guest asked her to move dishes. Behind her, the screen clearly displayed the agenda. 12:30 p.m. Keynote. Dr. Amina Blake. The coordinator frowned and began scanning the room. Back at the table, another guest whispered to her friend, "I think she might be someone. Didn't I see her name on the list?" Whispers traveled fast. A few people began checking the programs more closely. The name jumped out. Dr. Amina Blake, founder of Blake Strategies, global advisor, TED speaker, equity advocate. One by one, people began realizing what they had missed. But Amina wasn't looking for their realization. She was preparing. Her slides were loaded. Her mic was tested. Her time was coming. And when she finally stood, the room would see her. Not because she forced them to, but because she never let their assumptions force her out. This wasn't just about one lunch. This was about every room she'd been mistaken in, every voice she'd been asked to silence, and every chair she'd sat in, quietly, patiently, until the whole room turned to face her. Her name was on the screen. Her moment was next. And the ones who had asked her to clear their plates had no idea they were about to be served a lesson they would never forget. It started slowly, like a shift in air pressure, like a whisper before a storm. No one made a loud announcement. No spotlight turned. But something had changed. At first, it was just a glance. Then a second one. A pause in a conversation. A furrowed brow. People were starting to notice. A few guests at nearby tables began to watch the woman who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room. The one they had seen carrying her own tote, not joining the conversations, not rushing to be seen. The one some had mistaken for staff. The one others had handed glasses and napkins to without question. She wasn't rushing around. She wasn't wearing black like the waitstaff. She had a name badge, just like them, except hers was printed in bold and placed higher on the lanyard, with a title below it that now drew attention. Dr. Amina Blake, keynote speaker. That realization moved through the room like slow wind, gentle but unstoppable. At the center table, a young woman in a burgundy blouse scrolled through the digital event program on her phone. She froze when she saw the name. Then, with wide eyes, she leaned toward the woman beside her. A quick whisper. Then another. The woman beside her turned to look toward the back table, toward Amina, and her expression shifted. Recognition. Embarrassment. Regret. Others followed. Across the ballroom, in soft waves, people began to realize they had misread the room. They had misread her. One woman who had asked Amina to refill a pitcher sat a little straighter in her seat. Her smile was gone. Her eyes stayed down. The man who had handed her a stack of napkins now stared quietly at the stage, as if trying to erase the moment from his memory. The pressure in the room changed. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't noisy. It was quiet, but thick. The kind of silence that fills a room when people start to feel the weight of what they didn't say, what they didn't see. And still, Amina didn't move. She sat where she had been all along. Still, calm. Her hands folded in her lap, her expression unchanged. She didn't look smug. She didn't look angry. She just looked ready. Across the room, a few younger guests had begun recording short clips. Nothing dramatic, just quiet videos showing Amina seated at her table while the big screen behind the stage flickered through the agenda slides. Her name was next. The captions added by viewers said enough. They really asked the keynote speaker to clean plates. Watch what happens when you assume. Her silence is louder than anything else in this room. One video caught a waiter apologizing awkwardly to Amina after realizing who she was. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But it was filmed. And soon, it would be shared. The whisper online had begun. Outside the venue, the event's social media intern checked the official hashtag. She was just supposed to be sharing highlights of speakers, posting group photos. But now her notifications were spiking. She saw the clips. She recognized the room. And she realized something was happening. Something that wasn't in the script. Back in the ballroom, the energy had shifted entirely. No one was laughing anymore. The tone of conversations had changed. Voices were lower. Smiles were tighter. Some guests were now clearly uncomfortable, their eyes flicking between Amina's table and the stage. More and more people were checking the program on their phones. The name stared back at them in black and white. Dr. Amina Blake, founder of Blake Strategies, consultant to Fortune 100 companies, keynote speaker. There was no hiding from it. One woman had the decency to whisper an apology across her table, her voice barely louder than a breath. But Amina didn't need apologies. She had waited. She had endured. And now, she had everyone's attention, without raising her voice once. It was the kind of power that didn't have to knock. It simply stood at the door and waited for people to realize they had locked it. On the far end of the ballroom, a tall man in a navy suit, one of the event's planning team, was now speaking into a headset. He was trying to find the event manager. There was concern in his voice, not because anything was broken, but because the room felt like it was about to break. He asked, in a low voice, "Is the keynote speaker here?" Someone answered, "She's been here for almost an hour." The man looked across the room, and then he saw her. His eyes widened. He whispered, "Oh no." He understood what had happened. He knew now that the speaker, the leader the event was built around, had been sitting in plain sight, mistaken, ignored, erased. And now, the whole room knew it too. People checked their phones again. The tweets were spreading. The live stream was starting. And the clock was ticking. The announcer stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The room fell into stillness. It was time. The moment had come. And the woman they had asked to carry dishes was about to carry the entire room. Not out of anger, out of truth. Because when the crowd finally turned to look, she was already standing. The energy in the ballroom had changed. People were no longer just talking. They were watching. They were whispering in small circles, pointing with their eyes rather than their fingers. The woman they had mistaken for staff was now being spoken about quietly, as someone important, as someone they might have overlooked. But Dr. Amina Blake hadn't changed at all. She still sat with the same quiet grace, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. She hadn't said a word to correct anyone. She hadn't posted online or asked for attention. The room had simply caught up to her presence. Sometimes power doesn't arrive with noise. It waits, knowing that the moment of truth will come on its own. At the front of the room, the event coordinator stood near the stage with her clipboard. She was going over last-minute cues with the audiovisual team. The luncheon had gone mostly to plan, but she was behind schedule by a few minutes. She flipped the page on her agenda and froze. The next name listed, Dr. Amina Blake, was the keynote speaker. She frowned, looking around the room. She hadn't seen anyone approach the stage. She turned toward one of the volunteers and asked if the speaker had arrived. The volunteer gave her a blank look and shrugged. Somewhere across the ballroom, a staff member finally stepped forward and whispered, "She's been here the whole time. She's sitting at table 9. The coordinator turned her head sharply toward the far side of the room. Her eyes landed on Amina, and her stomach dropped. She remembered her now, the woman who had arrived earlier, calm and alone, with a badge that clearly showed her name and title. The one she had nodded past. The one several people had mistaken for support staff. The one who had never said a word when others had told her to clear plates and pour water. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. At table 9, Amina stood up. It was not rushed. It was not dramatic. It was simply time. She smoothed the front of her blazer, picked up her leather case from the floor beside her chair, and walked slowly toward the stage. Her steps were steady, controlled, quiet, but each one carried weight. Eyes followed her now. There was no applause. Not yet, but the room seemed to hold its breath. The MC on stage was in the middle of a rushed introduction. She had only just been handed a slip of paper with details about Amina's background, and she was reading it aloud in a fast, uncertain voice. The audience, however, wasn't listening to the words. They were watching the woman approach the podium, the same woman they had either ignored, overlooked, or wrongly assumed did not belong. Amina reached the edge of the stage and paused. For a moment, the sun from the tall windows caught her badge, the silver letters glinting under the light. She stepped up to the mic. There was no dramatic entrance music, no camera flashes, just the quiet sound of people realizing they had been wrong. She didn't need to speak loudly. Her presence did most of the talking. The room, now fully silent, watched as she placed her notes gently on the podium. She looked across the crowd, not with anger, not with pride, but with something deeper. Stillness. For days, maybe weeks, some in that room would think back to that expression. It was not there to shame them. It was there to show them something they had forgotten. That assumptions can erase people in plain sight, and that the ones you erase often carry the most powerful stories of all. Amina took a deep breath and began. She didn't start with her degrees. She didn't list her achievements. She didn't recite the names of companies she had advised or the number of lives she had changed through her work. She started with the lunch, with what had happened. She described how, in a room full of women who had gathered to speak about inclusion and leadership, she had been treated like she was there to serve, not to lead. She didn't point fingers. She didn't name names. She just told the truth. She shared how many times in her life that same scene had played out. Different faces, different places, same feeling, same invisibility. She spoke gently, but clearly, and her words landed like thunder. The crowd stayed still, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. This was not a woman demanding to be seen. This was a woman finally being recognized for what she had been all along. Every person in that ballroom now saw the disconnect, the gap between the event's glossy branding and the way they had allowed assumptions to go unchecked. And still, Amina spoke not to punish, but to teach. Because that is what true leaders do. They take moments of pain and turn them into lessons. By the end of her speech, many in the audience had tears in their eyes. Some clapped, then others followed, until the room was on its feet, offering not just applause, but something more meaningful. Acknowledgement, not of status, not of power, but of the humanity they had overlooked. Amina stepped away from the mic with the same grace she had arrived. No one would forget her, and no one would forget the moment they nearly missed her completely. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a room is one person refusing to let erasure win. There are moments in life that happen quietly but change everything. Not with noise, not with conflict, but with simple, undeniable truth. As Dr. Amina Blake stepped off the stage, the energy in the room was not the same as when she had walked up. Something had shifted. The people in the audience had heard her speak, not just with her words, but with her calm, powerful presence. They had seen someone they had misjudged reveal who she really was. And now, they couldn't unsee it. But the moment wasn't finished yet. There was more to come. Some of the women who had earlier handed her dishes were now frozen in their chairs, their faces pale. They looked down at their napkins or their name tags, hoping to avoid her eyes. Others watched her closely, guilt and surprise mixing on their faces. They remembered what they had said, the gestures, the glances, all the little things that had seemed harmless in the moment but now felt heavy. The same guests who had smiled at her as if she were invisible were now trying to smile again, but differently. Now they smiled like people who were caught, not by a camera, not by a rule, but by the truth. And it was everywhere now. The volunteer from the tech team stood near the edge of the ballroom, eyes wide. He had seen it too. Earlier, he had assumed she was someone from setup crew. He had offered her directions to the kitchen. Now he realized she was the very reason this event was happening. Her name was not on the margins of the program. It was printed on the front cover, in bold. The event coordinator, who had just minutes earlier been looking for her, now stood quietly off stage, her clipboard held tightly to her chest. She had been planning this day for months, but in all her planning, she hadn't planned for this. The deep, visible gap between the values printed in the event booklet and the behavior shown on the floor. And then there was the waitress, the first one who had asked Amina to clear table 4. She had returned to the back of the room after her break. She watched from a distance as Amina spoke, her hands trembling slightly. She had not known, but the memory of her tone, her snap, her words, they rang louder now than they had in the moment. It wasn't just embarrassment that filled her. It was something harder, the knowledge that she had played a part in something she didn't understand and couldn't take back. But this story wasn't about punishment. Amina hadn't come to shame anyone. She had come to speak. She had come to lead. And without saying it, she had done something even greater. She had shown them what quiet power looked like. Now, as the room sat in reflection, another truth was slowly rising. Phones had been recording. Videos were already being posted. Short clips of Amina's speech were spreading, online, on group chats, through social media feeds. Someone had captured the moment when her name appeared behind her on the screen as she stood at the microphone. Someone else had uploaded the earlier moment when she was asked to remove napkins. People watching from outside the room were beginning to understand what had happened. And inside the room, no one could deny it anymore. The MC returned to the stage, her voice shaky. She thanked Amina for her honest and powerful words. But the applause was softer now. The audience wasn't clapping out of politeness. They were clapping because they didn't know what else to do. They were still processing. Amina returned to her seat, and this time, no one mistook her for staff. No one dared to speak to her without knowing who they were speaking to. She was no longer the woman quietly sitting in the background. She was the moment, and that moment was not just a lesson for the guests at the luncheon. It was a reminder for every workplace, every boardroom, every conference that said it wanted diversity, but wasn't ready to respect it. What had happened that day wasn't rare. That was the part that stung the most. It happened all the time, in different cities, in different forms, in different rooms. But most of those stories never made it past the walls they happened in. This one would. Because this time, the person they had erased refused to disappear. The social media intern from the event watched the clips gaining views online. She sat in the media booth, speechless. She had captured the moment without meaning to. But now that it was out there, she knew it was bigger than this event. This wasn't just a conference mistake. It was a story, one that would be shared and reposted and remembered. By the time the lunch ended, more people had come up to Amina. Some offered thanks. Some apologized. Some stood in silence, unsure of what to say. A few hugged her, tears in their eyes. They weren't all the ones who had made assumptions. Some had simply watched and said nothing. That silence hurt too. But Amina welcomed them all. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the next woman who looked like her wouldn't be asked to carry dishes when she was carrying a message. It was about making sure the next young girl who looked like her saw someone standing at the podium, not cleaning the table. It was about changing the story. And that change had already begun. Outside the venue, a banner still fluttered in the wind, leading with purpose. No one who had attended would forget how clearly they had seen those words come to life. Because the woman they had almost overlooked had shown them exactly what purpose looked like. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand her seat. She earned every second of that room's attention by being exactly who she had always been. And finally, they saw her. Not because she asked them to, but because they couldn't ignore her anymore. The applause had ended, but the echo remained. As guests left their tables, the usual chatter that followed a keynote speech was missing. Conversations were quieter. Eyes wandered. The hum of excitement had been replaced with reflection and, for some, discomfort. Dr. Amina Blake had returned to her seat. She sat just as calmly as she had when the event began, but everything around her had changed. Now, people moved differently in her presence. No one handed her plates. No one asked her for coffee. People no longer looked through her. They looked at her, with a mix of guilt, admiration, and something else. Awareness. The weight of what had happened had settled on every corner of the ballroom. There were no more assumptions now, only understanding and the consequences that came with it. Some guests quietly packed their bags, unsure whether to approach her. Others stood nearby in small groups, replaying the moments they had witnessed or taken part in. One woman, who had earlier gestured for Amina to pour water, now stood motionless near the doorway, eyes on the floor. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any apology. In a corner of the room, the event planning team huddled together, speaking in low voices. Their leader held the event schedule in one hand and her phone in the other. Notifications were coming in rapidly. Social media posts had picked up. Videos were circulating. Tweets and short clips had been shared beyond the city, beyond the state. It was no longer just a luncheon. It was a story, and it was spreading. The video that had started it all, a short clip of Amina being asked to clear a table, had already passed 20,000 views. The caption read, "This is the woman they asked to serve." 10 minutes later, she served the truth instead. Other clips showed her stepping to the stage, the banner behind her, the room falling silent. But not everyone online had only watched the speech. Some people had begun searching her name. They found the truth. Dr. Amina Blake wasn't just a speaker. She was a founder, a CEO, a former policy advisor. She had worked in boardrooms around the world. She had mentored thousands of women. She had written books about leadership and change. She had helped companies recover after crises. And now, she had become a quiet crisis for this event. Calls began coming in. Reporters asking for comment. Invitations from news outlets. Messages from other companies, requesting her for speaking engagements. Her inbox filled quickly, not just with praise, but with apologies. People who had seen what happened, people who had made the same assumptions in their own lives, people who had never thought much about how deep unconscious bias could go. The hotel manager arrived shortly after. He had been alerted by the front desk after a staff member showed him the video. The footage of his team asking a guest, the guest of honor, to clear plates had become the most shared content of the day. The manager spoke with the event coordinator, his expression unreadable. Then he asked to speak with Amina. She listened calmly. She nodded when needed. She said very little. She did not ask for anyone to be punished. She did not request compensation. She simply reminded them that mistakes carry weight and that silence was not the same as resolution. The hotel promised to review its training. The event coordinator issued a public message that same day. She admitted the error, took responsibility, and apologized. But by then, the story had taken a life of its own. Staff members who had worked the luncheon met in private that evening. Some admitted they hadn't realized how they had spoken to her. Others said they felt ashamed, embarrassed, unsure how to fix what had already happened. A few of them cried. It wasn't about getting caught. It was about what they now saw in themselves. The waitress, the first one who had spoken to Amina, wrote a letter, not to be shared online, not to be sent to the media, just a quiet, personal letter. In it, she admitted how fast her assumptions had come and how little she had questioned them. She had not meant harm, but she had caused it anyway, because harm doesn't always shout. Sometimes it comes in small, polite moments, handing someone a napkin and assuming they're there to serve you. The consequences weren't legal. They weren't about lawsuits or public firings. They were about change. Real, slow, honest change. The company that had sponsored the event sent a statement within 24 hours. They said the moment had taught them more than they had expected. They promised to review how their events were structured, who was welcomed, who was seen. They said they would work with outside consultants to train not just staff, but leadership. And they asked Amina if she would help. She agreed, not out of pride, not for revenge, but because she believed that change must begin in the rooms where it was missing. By the end of the week, Amina had become more than a keynote speaker. She had become a symbol, not of anger, but of truth, not of outrage, but of dignity. She did not raise her voice. She raised awareness. And the rooms she had once been invisible in were now working to make sure no one else would feel what she had felt. This was the quiet power of grace. This was what it looked like when consequences didn't destroy, but rebuilt. And all of it had begun with one mistaken order: clear that table. 10 minutes later, the world was clearing its vision instead. Time passed, but the story stayed alive. What happened that day inside the Horizon Conference Center didn't end with a speech or an apology. It didn't stop with a social media post or a trending hashtag. It reached further, into conference rooms, classrooms, training programs, and policies that had never before been questioned. Because stories like this one don't just stir people. They shake systems. Dr. Amina Blake had not asked for a movement, but she had become the spark of one. In the weeks following the event, clips of her keynote continued to spread. Quiet footage of her being mistaken for staff still found its way into conversations. Not because of how she was treated, but because of how she responded. Her calm, her dignity, her choice to stay silent until the moment spoke louder than anger ever could. That silence turned into a mirror, and people everywhere were forced to look. It began small. The hotel where the event was hosted rolled out mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, from front desk clerks to top-level managers. Not a one-hour online course, but a series of in-person sessions focused on microaggressions, identity assumptions, and the dangers of invisible prejudice. The sessions used Amina's story as a real-world example. The training included a video of her speech, not just the polished ending, but the raw beginning. Her being handed napkins, the mistaking of her role, the way no one noticed until they were forced to. It was uncomfortable, but that was the point. The hospitality group that owned the venue followed with a company-wide campaign called See the Whole Person. They updated their onboarding process to include modules on inclusion that went beyond customer service scripts. They focused on perception, body language, and internal bias. Their slogan was simple: don't just serve, recognize. Then, the event host, the leadership group behind the luncheon, did something few expected. They asked Amina to help rewrite their future. She met with their board not as a guest, but as a consultant. She helped redesign the structure of their events, how people were seated, how speakers were welcomed, how staff were trained, and how invitations were sent out with clearer systems of respect built in. She created a checklist for every professional gathering. Who are we assuming belongs in this space? Who are we not seeing, even when they're right in front of us? What silent rules do we follow that make people feel invisible? They called it the Blake Framework. Before long, other companies took notice. Invitations poured in from universities, nonprofits, government offices, and tech firms. Some wanted her to speak. Others wanted to listen. All wanted to learn. She said yes to the ones who were ready for change, not just headlines. At one corporate retreat, executives sat in silence as Amina replayed a clip of herself being handed a dirty dish. No names were mentioned. No blame was spoken. But the message was clear. How many people in your company have been handed plates that weren't theirs? How many of them smiled and stayed silent because they knew the room would not be ready to hear their truth? The retreat ended not with applause, but with policies rewritten. And that wasn't the end. Her story became a featured case study in a university's leadership ethics course. Professors used it to show how real power doesn't always come from titles, but from how one handles disrespect. Students discussed not just her response, but their own biases. They started seeing the world around them more clearly. In a high school in Chicago, a teacher played the video in a classroom full of young black girls. When the footage ended, one of them whispered, "She looks like me." Another said, "I would have walked out, but she stayed." And a third, with tears in her eyes, said, "She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for us." Amina heard those words later in an email from the teacher. She read it quietly in her home office, then placed the message in a folder labeled, "Why I Keep Going." It reminded her of what mattered. Not the applause, not the headlines, but the ripple. The quiet, lasting ripple that happens when one person holds their ground and makes the world come to them, not out of pride, but out of purpose. Eventually, the leadership organization that hosted the original event asked her to join their board. It was not a PR move. It was real. They had watched her turn silence into a statement, and they wanted to build something better, with her at the table, not after they messed up, but before. She accepted, because she believed in repair. She believed that dignity can't be given. It must be respected. And once people truly see someone, they can never unsee them again. Years from now, many people will forget the menu from that day. They'll forget what song played when the lights dimmed. They'll forget what was served for dessert. But they won't forget the woman they mistook for a waitress. They won't forget how she walked to the microphone. They won't forget what she said with her voice and what she taught with her silence. She didn't change the world in one speech. She just changed one room. And from there, the world followed. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button to support stories that matter. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been misjudged or watched someone rise through quiet strength? Let's keep these conversations going, because every time we tell the truth, we help rewrite the room. Drop your thoughts. Share your stories. Be seen.